Today we'll look down that rabbit hole that's astrophotography. This hobby, like a rabbit hole, has many possible entrances and exits. And today I'll talk you through my journey and the exit route I took. We'll also answer the question, have you been Hubbled? No, it's not a new variant of you-know-what. It's an actual phenomenon. Let's look into that. Hi, I'm Tom and you're watching Rumour Has It. Since its launch in 1990, the Hubble telescope has wowed the public with its amazing images. The pillars of creation being the shot that really caught the public attention and caused a surge in interest in amateur astronomy. In today's video I'll cover a number of things from a beginner's point of view. I'll take you through my own journey and the impact of Hubble and the symptoms that developed from being Hubbled. In my own case, I've been interested since childhood, when a school friend invited me to visit after school and look through his father's telescope. This was way before Hubble, and even before we'd landed on the moon. I was blown away with my first views of Jupiter and its moons just glistening in the heavens. It made a huge impression on the young Tom. That interest has always lurked in the back of my mind, and it resurfaced in later years. By this time I'd already been interested in photography and had a Contax Yashica FX3 film camera. You remember them? But it wasn't until I got my first proper digital camera, a Canon 450D, around 2010, that I decided to see if I could combine my photography with my childhood memories of seeing the planets for the first time. I bought a cheap second-hand scope, my first of many mistakes. But I knew this would not get me where I wanted to be. I was pragmatic enough to understand that it would be a chance to learn the problems involved. Sure enough, I quickly learned the basics. The first one is to have realistic expectations. This is an issue I'll come back to later, as recently there's been a new symptom discovered that's a result of being Hubbled. It amazes me why many retailers will urge people to buy a cheap Newtonian on an even cheaper flimsy mount. Like this. As a first telescope, they're terrible. In my opinion, there's nothing more likely to put off a beginner. You might see many setups like this up for sale, and take my advice, no matter how cheap, don't buy one. Don't get me wrong, Newtonians can be wonderful scopes, and they're often called the poor man's refractor, as the design overcomes the problem of chromatic aberration. A 10-inch mirror is cheaper than a 4-inch APO chromatic reflector. You'll find out more about them later. But collimation, weight and size can be a problem. These problems are more apparent the cheaper the scope. Because the design is one of the cheapest to manufacture, there are some very cheap and nasty stuff being sold. Hence my warning, don't buy a cheap Newtonian unless you know what you're getting into. My next scope was a Schmidt Cassegrain. It was a Celestron Nexstar 6 SE. You can see that here. This was great for the moon and planets, and I got some of my best early images of the moon using this telescope. This was the first telescope with a computerized handset, which allowed you to navigate the thousands of objects which can't be seen by the human eye. And this is where the rabbit hole really starts. It's where I started getting interested in deep space objects, or DSOs. And you quickly realise that to capture the light from these faint DSOs, you have two choices: more photos, stacked, or longer exposures, and usually a combination of both. This then leads you to consider faster telescopes, better mounts, better cameras, better alignment, and capture software. In no time at all I found myself the owner of a Skywatcher NEQ6 Pro mount and a 10-inch f4 carbon fibre Newtonian and a cooled astronomy specific camera and plus a guide scope with a guide camera. This is obviously the end result of a steep learning curve. It's also at least one exit route from that rabbit hole I talked about earlier. There are many exit routes to a rabbit hole, as you know, and I'll go into the easier ones in detail with another video. But for now I'll continue this story. I got my first real DSO object in 2014, and this was M81, which is almost directly overhead. It's It's also known as a cigar galaxy. I wanted to capture this object in 2014 specifically, as there was a supernova event in that galaxy back then. And I was keen to make that my first ever image, and you can see that now. This is where I hit the next problem. Although the 10-inch Newtonian is a fantastic scope, it's a bit of a sail in the wind, and as you can tell, it's quite a windy day today. And with a 1000mm focal length, I found it difficult to get long exposure due to the wind, and to some extent variables in the NEQ6 mount itself. Although it's a very strong mount, and it operates very smoothly, the pixel accuracy needs to be so good on a scope like this that you really need to be using a guiding system. And this is where guiding and software control enters the frame, and it replaces the hand controller still sold with many of these mounts. From where I started in 2014, there's been huge strides in computer control. Back then I was using several different astronomy applications to achieve an image. Polar alignment, using the visual and clock method. And this is to ensure the mount is accurately aligned and can follow objects as they rotate around the celestial pole, or more accurately, as the Earth rotates around its celestial pole. The stars stay pretty much static. And this is where an astronomy mount comes into its own. That basically counteracts the Earth's rotation and keeps everything static in the night sky. Now getting back to how things operated in 2004. After polar alignment, we did a star alignment, and I personally used the Align Master program. And this is so the scope knows where it's pointing in the heavens and can navigate to objects. Then you have planetarium software, and in my case this was Stellarium. And this allows you to get the coordinates of each target and then send them to the mount. The mount itself is controlled by software called the EQ mod, which allows the PC to control the mount in place of the handset and gives you access to the full features of the SynScan system, which is Skywatcher's proprietary software. And then you had guiding software like PhD2, or at that time it was just PhD. And this is so you can accurately align with the movement of the stars and also correct for errors in the mount and in polar alignment. The principal method of focusing back then was using Bahtinov masks, and that's a very small one. Bahtinov masks are used to ensure their focus is accurate and can be calibrated as the temperature changes or as you move the camera during the night. Then with the actual capture software, which in my case was called Backyard EOS. The principal aim of this was to control the camera and get the correct exposures and calibration frames. The next big thing back then was light pollution filters. Now these were in their infancy back then, but they've come on quite a way now. And this is typical of a light pollution filter, at least a modern one. As I said, back then they were in their infancy, but nowadays they've revolutionised astrophotography with narrowband filters. They'll look at only a specific wavelength of light. Now astroimaging, even from urban areas, is possible, because these allow you to photograph DSOs through light polluted skies by only capturing specific wavelengths of light and ignoring much of what pollutes our night sky, especially in towns and cities. Once you've captured your images, then the first stage was to use a program like Deep Sky Stacker to stack them all together and to calibrate for the various noise defects. After stacking, I used to process my images in Photoshop. So typically I'd be sitting there at a small desk with my laptop on it and leads going to the mount. This was fraught with danger. Power for the camera, power for the guide camera, power for the mount, data from both cameras, data from the mount. It was a pretty complex setup and a lot could go wrong. Well, it's totally changed nowadays. All 7 of the software packages and all of the power leads, all of the data connections are controlled by this little box, the ASI Air. It handles mount control, autofocus, semi-automatic polar alignment, plate solving, which is a better form of star alignment, capture, and it also contains a planetarium. And the laptop I used to control all of this is now replaced by an iPad. So a simple app on the iPad allows me total control over the mount, and it's all done wirelessly. And the ISA isn't the only means of doing that. Nowadays you can buy a Raspberry Pi and you can install software on that. There's one called Astrophotography, which is free, and there's another one called StellarMate, which is more regularly updated. And that package does cost somewhere about $50, but once you've bought it, it's yours for life. Raspberry Pis can be bought quite cheaply as well. If you buy them direct from Raspberry themselves, you can get a Pi starting from about £35. Now recently, because of price gouging and shortages, the price has shot up, but you can still get them when they're in stock for the correct price. These alternatives to the ASIA all have strengths and weaknesses. I chose the ASIA for its simplicity of integration and the user interface, but I'm also experimenting with the Raspberry Pi and StellarMate because it's not tied to ZWO devices like the ASIA. So I'm hoping to use it with various cameras and equipment that have accrued over the years. Now so far I haven't covered processing, but this is also an area where there's been huge strides, with astronomy specific processing tools being developed like Pixie Insight and Cyril. Now these will automatically handle stacking, calibration and image processing with advanced techniques like automatic background extraction and automatic star extraction. Many people trying astrophotography for the first time are confused and puzzled when faced with an image like this, and then astounded when they learn how to turn that into an image like this. Now if you looked at the equipment I've shown you and listened to the story, you might be put off by thinking this is going to be far too expensive for me. But I have another video planned on a low cost entry into that, so I'll tell you more about that at the end. As for the cost of equipment, I keep an eye on astronomy equipment, used astronomy equipment. It's a good way to pick up a bargain and reduce the cost of entry to the hobby. Recently I've seen some mega expensive equipment coming up for sale at bargain prices. It seems that during lockdown many people bought expensive equipment and then found they didn't have the time, patience or skill to get the images even close to those Hubble photos. So this could be a good time to buy a bargain and get into the hobby if you're interested. Now despite all the technical advances which have automated much of those skills in the hobby, there remains a large area that's left to individual interpretation. It's one of the most difficult parts to learn, and it's the part that makes the imaging special, and that is the final processing. It's here where the real skill remains. No two images look alike, even if they're taken on the same equipment and on the same night. Everybody processes them differently. It's a whole subject in itself, so I'll not cover it in this video. However, I'm happy to show you some of my own photos I've captured recently, and you'll see what's possible with today's equipment and software. These images are pleasing to most eyes, even with modest amateur equipment. Believe me, you can spend a lot more than I have. Going back to that image in 2014 of M81, taken with the equipment I've shown you, and compare that with my latest image of M81 and M82, taken with the benefit of the ASIA and guiding, whereas the 2014 shot was unguided. Now I might be able to answer another question that most people have, and that's, can you make money out of astrophotography? When I show non-astrophotographers my images, they say, wow, you should print that and sell it. My response is always to tell them that although I'm happy with my images, I know there's always a much better image out there already. The very best images that no amateur can compete with are really from the Hubble. So as far as selling images go, you could say we've all been Hubbled. If this little story has piqued your interest, or maybe like me you've always had a hankering to try astrophotography, in my next video I'll cover the first steps towards imaging and the equipment you'll need. This is equipment that you might very well own today if you're a photographer. All you need to get started is a tripod, a camera and an intervalometer. So look out for my next video on that. I promise it won't take so long for my next upload. The next 3 are planned out. Now let's do a bit more channel chat. This is a section where I'll tell you a little bit more about my plans, and also it's an opportunity for you to ask me any questions, and I can add them in these channel chats. I hope you enjoy this venture into astronomy. I plan to add related content like this, as well as my walkabout videos. I'll continue to post the bigger stories in news and rumour, but as you know, I've been spending more time on my astronomy hobby lately, so to me it makes sense to include that in my content. It takes me a few days to script, research, film and edit my videos, so aligning them with what I spend my time on makes sense to me. Hopefully you'll still be happy to subscribe and enjoy my content. The buttons are down there to let me know. Now why not try this video next, which YouTube thinks might interest you, or perhaps this one might suit you better. Thanks for watching Rumour Has It. I hope you'll be back soon, and hopefully I'll be back soon as well.